To get things started, can you please tell us a little bit about the customer development process and how you develop it?
Sure. So I think as was mentioned, I did 8 startups in 21 years here in the Valley. Everything from military intelligence to supercomputers to video games, etc. And the track record after 21 years was 4 IPOs, a couple of which I actually had something to do with other than sitting in the company where it happened. But more interestingly, the 2 craters were craters so deep they have their own iridium layer. And only in Silicon Valley can you recover from a crater so deep. In fact, one of them, my next to last startup, I lost $35 million worth of capital money. Thank God it wasn't yours, or we wouldn't be sitting here.
Actually, I think it was.
So it took us 10 years to actually have this conversation. But my mother was an immigrant from Russia, and I called my mom after I created the company. And I called her up, and English still was not her first language after 50 years in the country, or maybe 70 years in the country. I said, "Mom, I lost $35 million. And it was like silence. And then, "Mom, are you still there?" She said, "You lost $35 million? Where'd you put it?" I said, "No, Mom, I lost it and spent it." And then there were 3 or 4 languages I didn't even understand. I thought Russian and Polish were, "We can't go anywhere. We can't change our names. It's already blank." And I said, "No, Mom, the reason I'm calling you is that I just raised another $12 million from venture capitalists." And there was you could just hear more silence. And then she said, "Only in America are the streets paved with gold." And in fact, what I explained to a ton of visitors from foreign countries is that we have a special word in Silicon Valley, a special word for what we call failed entrepreneurs. Anybody know what that word is? Experience. It's a big idea, experience. Failure, an honest failure in Silicon Valley means you're an experienced entrepreneur. Now, you only get to be experienced 3 or 4 times when VCs no longer fund you, but you at least get one more shot, and which is a key idea here. One of the key cultural aspects of the Valley is you get multiple shots at the goal. And so to answer your question, where I came up with customer development is after my last startup, that $12 million, I turned into $1 billion each for the 2 VCs who funded me in the last bubble. And having done 8 startups and having children at the time, 7 and 8 years old, I decided that what I really would like to do is watch my children grow up. I took the money off the table, went home and said, "I'll figure out something else to do, but I want to see my kids grow up." And for those of you who want to understand how you do 8 startups and still keep a marriage and have kids, there's a blog post I wrote called Epitaph for an Entrepreneur. And you'll kind of see how we managed to do that with a wife who also had a Stanford MBA. And so I was sitting there retired.
First, explain what it is before you get into how you
Customer development.
Yeah, just a brief description.
Customer development was, excuse the pun, the epiphany that said, we've been building startups like they were smaller versions of large companies. We've been doing that for the last 75 years, at least until I had this epiphany, which said VCs, the standard model was go write a business plan and go hire some execs and build sales, marketing, and biz dev, and go to alpha test, beta test, first customer ship, and this is what you should do. And maybe in alpha beta you'll test the product with customers, but you'll be in waterfall development, and first customer ship is what we're all shooting for. My insight was that was a mistake. Because in Silicon Valley, even though we were taking more technical risk per square foot than anywhere else in the world, we weren't failing because of failure of product development. We were failing because we didn't get enough customers and revenue. And while there were plenty of methodologies on how to manage product development, there was no methodology on how to manage customer development. In the customer development process, the insight was we needed a process that was unique to startups to reduce customer and market risk. And that was the original insight.
And there was far more money invested or spent in customer development than there was in product development.
Well, there was far more money being lost by not investing in customer development. That is, customer development, for those of you who are somewhere near Andy and I's age, there's probably 4 of you, the methodology used to be you hired a VP of sales with a great Rolodex, and they built a sales force, and you went to first customer ship, and their job was, by the VCs, execute the plan. No one ever asked, where the heck did the plan come from? Well, the plan came from the founders who were, had a good time trying to goal seek to $100 million in 5 years. Because that was the canonical model, was that you were going to have a $100 million business in 5 years. And no one ever asked is, well, wait a minute. We've made founders do income statements, balance sheets, cash flows, business plans, etc. Not ever once actually admitting to ourselves as an entire industry two things. One is, no business plan survives first contact with the customer. And in fact, while we ought to teach, I still believe we ought to teach business plan writing in universities like Stanford or Columbia, except we ought to teach it in the English department, because it's the best example of creative writing anybody ever done. Right? And two is, the 5-year plans that VCs required, no VC ever honestly said, is there anybody else who requires 5-year plans? Why, yes, the Soviet Union. And we know how well that turned out.
So the system that made no sense to you, right? So the system that made no sense to you sure worked pretty well. It developed all of Silicon Valley. If it ain't broke, why fix it?
Right, and I think what we found until the last bubble exploded in 2000 was that great IRRs covered up a multitude of sins. I mean, it was a wonderful process when there was a rising tide and lifted all boats. But
I like those days.
Yeah. But those days ain't coming back, or it could be like a cargo cult. We'll kind of pray for it to come back, but it isn't going to come back. And in fact, Andy, you remember in the 1980s and 70s, VCs were actually company builders. They were not financial engineers. It used to be that you couldn't take a company public on NASDAQ without 5 profitable quarters. Remember those days? Those days ended in August 1995. Remember what happened in August 1995? Netscape went public. Netscape proved there was a market for a company with no profits and great potential. And venture capitalists, because that was in fact what they were optimizing, optimize it for financial returns. And said, okay, now the game for during that bubble period was put an E in front of your name. We did it too, and first mover advantage and everything else. And gee, we'll optimize how much capital we could get out of the investment banking system. And it worked until it didn't. But then we were picking up rubble for 3 years, and then we had to, for the last 10 years, figure out how to go back to how to build companies, but smarter. Does this make sense? And in the last 10 years, we actually learned a lot about what we didn't even know in the 60s, 70s, and 80s about company building. And that's the stuff that I've been teaching, Eric Ries has been teaching, Alexander Osterwalder's been teaching, and it's a real big idea. The sum is a really powerful idea.
So one of the jokes in business school is whatever the students want to go to work for, or whatever industry they want to work in, is the industry you should short. Because they're always late at this. So how do we know that this whole new movement that you promoted isn't just a fad?
Well, I could ask you the same about venture capital, because it still might be a fad. Actually, given the returns in the last 10 years, it probably is. Actually, it's more like a 501c3 right now, given my investments in VC funds. But I think it's a fair question. And I think it's probably worth backing up and saying, what fad are we talking about? And the fad we're talking about is this whole lean startup, customer development movement. What is this stuff? What is this stuff says, hey, we now know something we didn't know or think we didn't know 10 years ago. Can I go? So, as you know in business schools, the word entrepreneurship has been taught and classes have been taught since probably, I don't know, Miles Mason, Harvard, HBS, 1947. George DeRose was teaching venture capital implicitly in his manufacturing class in the HBS in the 1940s. Stanford Business School here had the first small business class in 1953. So entrepreneurship isn't new in a business school, but the idea that's new is instead of thinking of startups as smaller versions of large companies, we now have a new big idea. The new big idea is that's wrong. Startups are not smaller versions of large companies. You cannot think that, gee, I understand how to do consulting or management at General Motors or a large corporation, and therefore I understand how to manage 2 people in a garage. It turns out the distinction is as follows. Large companies execute known business models at their core. Startups, in their first year or 2, search for business models. This distinction between execution and search is what distinguishes an early stage venture from an existing corporation. And we were never able to say that before. We saw all evidence of it. We were never able to articulate it. Because what that means is the classes you learn in business school for execution, the tools you learn in business school for execution are not only wrong, they're destructive in the early days of the startup. They are damaging. You will do damage to an early stage venture if you bring those skill sets into a startup. A startup is as follows. A startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. The type of people we hire are different for search. The type of financials we need to know for search are different. The types of processes we use to find the business model are different. We're not doing execution. And what we've been doing over the last 10 years is building the equivalent of the management tool set that we built for MBAs over the last 100. We're starting to, right now, just build a tool set for entrepreneurs that include business model design, customer development, agile engineering, management teams for startups, etc. All the things that we've built for execution, we're starting to understand we need to build for search. Customer development is one of those pieces in that entrepreneurial map.
So your most famous disciple, Eric Ries, who coined the term the lean startup, and all of this came from you, likes to say that using this methodology, anyone can be an entrepreneur. What do you think of that?
I think Eric's selling something when he says that. I think that's just simply wrong. If Eric was here, I'd ask him to go back to class. And we would just disagree. This is the distinction for me. And how many of you were in business school or have been in business school? Come on, raise your hand. All right. I'm going to tell you a question I get at least once a year from an MBA in one of my classes. And it's a job choice they have. I always get, Professor Blank, I'm trying to make a job decision. Really? What's the decision? Well, I got this great offer from McKinsey. Wow, McKinsey. Great company. Great. Congratulations. Well, yeah, but I'm kind of torn. Well, what's your other choice? Well, me and my roommates want to do this startup. The rest of you aren't laughing, so I'm going to explain to you why this is because my jaw now drops. Because I say, you've already decided. And they go, no, don't you want to hear about the startup and what we're doing? And I said, no, you've already decided. There is no possible way you could keep McKinsey and a startup in your head at the same time and believe it's a choice.
If you're an entrepreneur.
This is where I'm going. But thank you for the lead-in. Entrepreneurship is not a job. Let me say it again. At least if you want to be on the founding team of a startup, it's not a job. And that's the mistake that we just do a disservice to all of you. Entrepreneurship is a calling. Because it's taught in business schools or engineering schools, we think it's kind of like MBAs or engineers. It's not. The closest thing to being a founder of a startup is being an artist. It's a big idea. Not just a performer, but a composer or a sculptor or a painter who sees something they need to get out of their system and bring to fruition. And if you're not driven by passion, then you ought to take the job at McKinsey or join the startup as an employee later on and when it has some sense of profitability. But the fact that it's popular now confuses people. Entrepreneurship is not a job. Because in a room like this, how many of you want to be entrepreneurs? Come on, raise your hand. In a room like this, most of you would have been better off working at Walmart. The good news, though, is in this room, for those of you who raised your hand, one of you will be worth $100 million in the next 7 years. Look around. Look around. Raise your hand again. Who wants to be entrepreneurs? Raise your hand. Now, The bad news is those of you who are looking around figuring out who to work for shouldn't be in entrepreneurship. Those of you who are looking around feeling sorry for the other poor son of a bitches in the room are the ones who ought to be entrepreneurs. Think about that for a minute. Entrepreneurship requires passion, vision, and commitment in a scale that you don't get in an execution job. Doesn't mean you don't work hard in a 9-to-5 job or an 8-to-12 job and travel a lot in McKinsey or some other great job, management position. There's not only nothing wrong with those jobs, that's what normal people do. Founders are not normal. Founders see things other people don't. And the problem is before we had some methodology, about 95% of them weren't having visions, they were actually hallucinating.
So speaking of methodology,
yes.
So for those of you who...
are we pitching a book?
So Steve's original book was called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, and I use it as one of the textbooks.
And by the way, this was my class notes from Berkeley, that when I made Eric Rees take the class, he said, why don't you put a cover on it and put it on Amazon so we could blame Eric for all the unfinished sentences? And then 10 years later...
10 years later, we have the Startup Owner's Manual. Now, the methodology that you teach in this book, will it lead to greater success?
Right. So that's a great question.
That's what everybody's here for.
Right. So the bad news is, anybody who tells you, read this book or follow this process and you will be more successful, is trying to sell you something. Trying to sell you something. And maybe they're right. The good news is I'm retired and I'm not selling something. I can tell you, though, a big idea, and I'm going to answer your question. I think with business model design, customer development, and agile engineering, the sum of those three, we have cracked the code of entrepreneurship. Not how to make you personally more successful, but to make a room like this of entrepreneurs, I will guarantee you, fail less. And that's a big claim. Across a portfolio, if you follow a methodology, we now know how to make this group fail less. That's different from I know how to make you personally succeed more. Possibly, but I could guarantee you we can make you fail less.
So what makes you succeed more? So what's the Pareto? What is the issue that is likely to lead to great success in at least technology entrepreneurship?
So, one of the things we now know is that entrepreneurship by itself is kind of, for any computer scientists in the room, because we could point to them later to explain this to the rest of you, is an NP-complete problem. Meaning it's computationally unsolvable. There's just a million variations on the things you can do when you wake up in the morning. The problem is until we had some form of methodology or framework, all we had was random war stories. Just go do this, go do that. In fact, if you wanted any opinion, you could go get one. What we've now done is put a bounding box around an NP-complete problem and made it just an NP problem. Very hard, but it's in fact solvable. And in fact, as an entrepreneur, if I was an entrepreneur, I would try to be understanding three things. What is my business model? And inside the business model, the stuff you teach. What's my product market fit? That is, who are my customers? What's my value proposition? And I'd be trying to understand how to get out of the building and test that as much as I can, as early as I can. Those three stupidly simple things kind of raise the odds of success by decreasing the odds of failure.
So assuming you become good at customer development, what's the next big challenge for us?
Well, it's very funny that, the next big challenge is, well, gee, what if I'm right? Oops. Now I'm faced with scaling the company. And for me, it's, I've said this a lot, and Eric now says it a lot too. A lean startup is not a cheap startup. It just is a matter of when you spend the money. The mistake we made, let's take the internet bubble, and this bubble as well. Anybody remember the internet bubble? Does anybody remember that? Or from some of you, ask your parents or grandparents. Or Andy and I would be happy to go do that. The internet bubble is where we had this thing called first mover advantage. You might remember that. Right? First mover advantage was this fantasy is that if we all got out there first, we would grab share and, therefore have this invulnerable position based on actually a paper a professor in GSB wrote named David Montgomery in 1984 said, you know, first mover advantage. It wasn't until all the VCs were pushing that theory that no one bothered to notice that Montgomery retracted that paper with another paper called first mover parens disadvantage. But by then we already started the bandwagon. It turns out that in most businesses, actually, it's the second mover that has the advantage, but we forgot that. Make a long story short, in the last bubble, if in fact all the entrepreneurs who raised tens and hundreds of millions of dollars would have parked their money in the bank until the market actually would have matured, half of them would still be in business. They in fact believed, because of first mover advantage, that single-handedly they could accelerate technology diffusion. They were just simply wrong, right? And so in that case, they were just too early and thought that cash by branding and advertising, that was the game. Actually, the other game that was being played was the financial engineering game, as if I could get them public and, you know, get a liquidity event. It didn't matter whether they had customers or not, but that's another story. What we now know is what you really want to do is achieve product market fit and see if you have something repeatable and scalable. And if and when you do, that's when you pour on the cash and start building an organization to execute.
And hire people who are experts at executing.
Well, here's the interesting thing. It's the secret memo that VCs never tell entrepreneurs. Ask me about the secret memo, Andy.
That is the secret memo.
The secret memo is the one Andy had for 30 years, and it's the secret memo that took me 30 years to figure out. If we think of startups as searching for a business model, and then when we found a repeatable model, we think execution. Great, we're ready to go. In fact, I used to think, imagine you were a founder of a startup. You know, it's been exhausting, you've been flying around 24/7, you've been driving your company crazy, your boards, you know, pulling their hair out. But one day, you found a repeatable model that is every week, revenue's going up at a predictable pace. And you're looking at this and you're so excited, you're going to like announce to the board, you found a repeatable and scalable business model. In fact, you're so excited, you've cleared the aisleways between the cubicles for the parade. And you've actually brought confetti in so your employees can throw it. And you've worn a sports jacket so they can pin the medal on you in the board meeting. Now, when your VCs pull up to your building, what you don't understand, if you have a traditional venture capitalist, how many boards did you sit on?
Total?
Yeah.
Oh, more than 30.
How many did you sit on at a time? A typical VC?
8.
8. Now, you think you're seeing one VC every 6 weeks. You're seeing 8, and some VCs 12, you know, of you. In fact, some of them are actually looking up your name in the parking lot, right? I mean, you know who they are, but you're not realizing they're seeing a whole bunch of you. So now you're in this board meeting, you're telling them you have found a repeatable and scalable business model. And they're looking at you in a way that's making you personally uncomfortable. I mean, they're looking at you like they've never looked at you like before in your life. What do you think they're thinking? What do you think they're thinking? What they're thinking is liquidity. And now they're thinking, is this crazy person going to take us to liquidity and like make me rich? Or is this crazy person now going to destroy the value they just built? And all of a sudden, that secret memo comes into play because the VCs kind of give each other the secret VC look and think operating executive.
Or some venture
capital. So the question I tell all potential founders who are going to get traditional VC in whatever round, ask their venture capitalists, potential VCs, what percentage of founders are still with your company after they found liquidity?
30%.
Right. Is that just your firm, or ex-firm, or?
No, that's what I think from watching the venture capital industry. I think about 70% of the founders get replaced as CEO. That doesn't mean fired necessarily.
Right. And how many of those founders do you think understood what skill set they needed to have as founders? Small percent. Secret memo. And I'm just, as a GSB class, most of you will be that operating set replacing that founder. All right? That's when you guys are brought in. Now, some of you might actually be the founder and might actually have that skill set. It's what happened to Jobs at Apple the first time. It's why Larry Ellison almost lost his company until they brought in Ray Lane. It's why Bill Gates had 5 presidents as he was chairman of Microsoft, sucking them dry, learning the skill sets necessary to run a company. So I don't know what your question was.
I asked you what the next big challenge was after the customer.
Yeah, well, after customer
figuring
development,
out
how to execute. The problem is it probably won't be you as the founder. And and the reason why most VCs don't tell founders when they're funding their company they're going to be replaced.
So what does an entrepreneur do to learn those skills?
In fact, the meta question is, gee, let's tell entrepreneurs that there's a different skill set necessary. Because, in fact, the lore in the valley still is, the VC stole my company, or they brought in the suit who screwed it up, without anybody ever articulating, let me explain the phases to the company. And why don't VCs tell founders on day one they're going to replace it?
They'll lose the deal.
They'll lose the deal. Truly. We're no joke here. It is the secret memo that, and it's not like anybody's doing anything bad, it's the entire industry is playing this game.
I wouldn't say everyone.
Yeah, but the guys who don't get the deals aren't telling them this. What we need to do, I believe, as an industry in general for entrepreneurial education, I call this phase, the one on the left, search, the one on the right, execution. The one in the middle I call the build phase, where you traditionally would bring in the operating exec. I just think we need to make entrepreneurs aware. Here's the skill set required. Here's what great operating execs do. Gee, if you want to apprentice, we'll bring in somebody and help you apprentice. And if you're a crazed entrepreneur, like I was, maybe your skill set ought to be in search, and let's go fund your next couple of startups in that phase, and we'll make you rich by the percentage of the ownership rather than you holding on the door frame as, the VCs are trying to push you out. But because we don't articulate what this is, this ends up as lore and, does this make sense here?
I'm the interviewer here, Steve.
No, wait a minute, this is a fireside chat. I'm interviewing you now.
Well, you're not here to hear my views, so we're here to hear yours.
So my view is we do a piss poor job of this. For, as you pointed out, the institutional reasons of no VC wants to be the bearer of bad news. But I think we've institutionalized the lack of education in both business schools and entrepreneurship education in the build phase that can actually lower the testosterone level on both sides by giving entrepreneurs who are great at search a different career path. Okay.
Do you think we can teach entrepreneurship?
For the decade I've been teaching entrepreneurship, I struggled with this question. Thank you for catching the joke. I think I answered it earlier, and I'm answering it again. One is, you can only teach entrepreneurship to volunteers. It's a big idea. You can't draft people to be entrepreneurs and founders. Why? Because it's like drafting somebody to take the art and sculpture class. You maybe could offer just like we offer art appreciation to everybody, so we should appreciate art, we could probably offer entrepreneurship appreciation, like small business. No, seriously. I think for this country and this culture and worldwide, we ought to have people appreciate the value of entrepreneurs. But once you get past appreciation, the appropriate curriculum to model is not business school, not engineering school, it's art school. You don't draft artists. It's people who have passion. And then, artists, they take theory classes.
So what's the purpose of entrepreneurship classes?
But they take theory classes, but more importantly in art school, we're not embarrassed to say it's a hands-on experiential game. And that's been the other problem with entrepreneurship education in both business schools and in general for the last 20 years.
So what is the purpose of entrepreneurship classes at graduate business schools?
I think at graduate business school it's to give both theory and practice. I think if you leave any graduate school and you haven't run a lemonade stand, let alone a startup, it's kind of like being a brain surgeon with just reading the books. I'm not sure I ever want to be your patient, and nor do I ever want you to near any startup I've ever been involved in. I think what graduate schools could give is incredible amount of theory, but what we've been missing is coupling the theory to practice. And I think Stanford is probably as good as any place that's learning how to do that. And I think we're seeing the emergence of hands-on entrepreneurship classes. I teach this class called the Lean Launchpad, both here at Stanford, at Berkeley, at Columbia, at Caltech. It was adopted by the National Science Foundation for commercializing all science and technology in the United States last year. It's been in a program called the Innovation Corps. And it couples all this theory into hands-on practice. We take 45-year-old principal investigators and their graduate students, people who we would never think had gotten out of the lab, and most of them haven't in 20 years. And we make them run as fast as 22-year-olds in hoodies and flip-flops. And they talk to over 100 customers in 10 weeks. These are 45-year-old PIs. And the transformation in what they're able to do and what they thought they could do is just enormous. But it's coupled with a large amount of theory as well.
So Steve, my last question, and then we're going to open it up for all of you.
That was having fun.
Is, are MBAs well suited to be technology entrepreneurs?
No.
Please explain.
I got to go now. So this is, and you notice how quick I was. I think this is the last invitation I'll ever have to the GSB. Let me do explain. It isn't that business school students shouldn't be part of technology companies, but for them to be founders. They're certainly capable of being operating executives, and they're certainly possible to be co-founders in a mix of technology entrepreneurs, and they're certainly possible to be founders of non-technology companies.